What if everything you've been praying for, everything you've been desperately seeking, every breakthrough you've been waiting for, has already been given to you? What if the reason your prayers feel unanswered isn't because God is distant, but because you're asking for something that's already yours? I know this sounds impossible, maybe even offensive to some, but stay with me for the next few minutes because what you're about to discover has the power to completely transform how you understand faith, prayer, and the very nature of God's provision in your life. When Jesus uttered those three final words from the cross, "It is finished," most of Christianity heard an ending. They heard defeat, tragedy, the last gasp of a dying man. But what if we've been getting it wrong for 2,000 years? What if those words weren't about death at all, but about revelation? Smith Wigglesworth, one of the most powerful men of faith in modern history, understood something that most believers completely miss. He discovered that Jesus wasn't announcing the end of his life, he was declaring the completion of something far more profound. Has this ever happened to you? You pray with all your heart for healing, for provision, for a breakthrough in your circumstances, yet nothing seems to change. You wonder if God is listening, if your faith is strong enough, if maybe you're doing something wrong. You add more prayer time, more fasting, more confession, more spiritual warfare, and still, the answer feels just out of reach. What if I told you that the problem isn't your lack of faith or your technique? What if the real issue is that you're trying to create something that already exists? Think about this for a moment. Smith Wigglesworth didn't heal thousands of people by begging God to do something new. He didn't manifest miracles by working harder or praying longer. He operated from a completely different consciousness, one that understood that in spiritual reality, everything is already complete. Every healing, every provision, every solution to every problem you face was finished 2,000 years ago. Not in some distant heaven that you have to reach, but in the eternal now of God's reality that exists right where you are at this very moment. This isn't positive thinking or mind games. This is something far more powerful, something that will challenge everything you thought you knew about prayer and faith. What you're about to discover might surprise you, but more importantly, it might finally set you free from the exhausting cycle of spiritual striving. Because when you truly understand what "it is finished" means, when you grasp the depth of what Smith Wigglesworth discovered through decades of walking with God, your entire approach to faith transforms. You stop trying to convince God to do something, and you start recognizing what God has already done. So let me ask you again, what if your breakthrough isn't something you need to create, but something you need to see? Imagine this scene for a moment. You're standing in the middle of a flowing river, crystal clear water rushing all around you, touching your ankles, your knees, your waist. The current is strong, the water is pure, and there's more than enough to satisfy any thirst imaginable. But here's the shocking part. You're dying of thirst. Your lips are cracked, your throat is burning, and with your last breath you're crying out to heaven, "God, please send me water, I'm desperate, I need water now." Can you see the tragedy in this? Can you feel the absurdity? Yet this is exactly how most of us approach prayer and faith. We're surrounded by the very thing we're begging for, completely immersed in divine provision, yet we can't see it because our mindset is locked into a consciousness of lack. But before we begin diving deeper into this revelation, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the globe. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. This is the hidden truth that transformed Smith Wigglesworth's entire ministry and shifted the trajectory of countless lives. The real journey isn't about getting God to move. It's about opening your eyes to see what God has already established. Every financial breakthrough you're praying for exists right now in spiritual reality. Every healing you're seeking is already present in the divine consciousness that surrounds you. Like water surrounds someone standing in a river, the problem has never been God's willingness or your worthiness. The problem is awareness. The problem is recognition. You're asking for something to be created when the real transformation happens the moment you realize it's already here. Now, most spiritual teachers will tell you exactly the opposite. They'll say you need to pray harder, fast longer, declare louder, visualize clearer, raise your vibration higher. They'll give you 10 steps, 7 keys, 40 days of breakthrough protocols. And I'm not saying those practices are bad, but what if they're all based on a fundamental misunderstanding? What if all that effort, all that spiritual striving, all that exhausting work to get God to move is actually keeping you from experiencing what's already been given? This is where Wigglesworth made a discovery that revolutionized everything. He realized that spiritual work isn't about doing more. It's about letting go of the belief that anything needs to be done at all. Think about the implications of this for your life right now. All those nights you've stayed up pleading with heaven. All those tears you've cried wondering why your prayers seem to hit a ceiling. All that frustration asking yourself what you're doing wrong. What if none of it was necessary? What if the finished kingdom has been right in front of you this entire time, and you've been trained to look past it, searching for something in the distance that's actually at your feet? This isn't about positive thinking or pretending your problems don't exist. This is about a fundamental shift in consciousness, a complete transformation in how you understand God's nature and how divine provision actually works in your life. The impact of this revelation doesn't just change how you pray, it changes how you live, how you make decisions, how you face challenges, and how you see yourself in relationship to the divine. Now I want to go even deeper into this revelation because understanding the water metaphor is just the beginning. When you truly grasp what it means that the kingdom is already finished, when you stop trying to earn or attract or manifest what's already been given, something profound happens in your spiritual experience. Write in the comments, "I'm ready to see what's already mine." Let me paint a real-world picture of what this looks like in practice. You wake up one morning and the financial crisis you've been dreading has finally arrived. Maybe it's an unexpected bill. Maybe you've lost your income. Maybe the numbers in your bank account are screaming impossibility at you. The panic hits first, that tight feeling in your chest, the racing thoughts, the overwhelming fear, and immediately, almost instinctively, you drop to your knees and start praying. But here's what happens in most cases. That prayer comes from desperation, from lack, from a place of begging God to create something that doesn't exist yet. You're asking heaven to send provision, to open doors, to miraculously make money appear. But what if that entire approach is backwards? If this resonates with you, hit that subscribe button. I'm creating content for people ready to go beyond surface-level spirituality, and I want you on this journey with me. If "it is finished" is true, if divine supply already exists in consciousness right now, then your work isn't begging or even manifesting. Your work is something completely different. It's resting in the truth that abundance is already established, already present, already yours in spiritual reality. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds nice spiritually, but I have real bills to pay, real deadlines approaching, real consequences if money doesn't show up. And you're absolutely right. This isn't about passive waiting while your life falls apart. This is about something far more powerful than passivity. It's about taking action, real, practical, necessary action, but from a completely transformed consciousness. Instead of making phone calls from panic, you make them from peace. Instead of sending emails from desperation, you send them from certainty. The external actions might look identical to someone watching from the outside, but the internal state, the consciousness behind those decisions, changes everything. And somehow, mysteriously, opportunities begin, appearing that weren't there when you were operating from fear. This is exactly how Smith Wigglesworth approached healing, and the results speak for themselves. Thousands of people experienced physical transformation through his ministry, not because he had some special power or technique, but because he understood this fundamental principle of recognition. When someone would come to him with cancer, with paralysis, with conditions doctors had declared hopeless, Wigglesworth didn't see disease that needed fixing. He didn't see a problem that required God to do something new. He saw something entirely different. He saw the finished spiritual perfection that had always been true about that person, regardless of what their body was showing. His recognition of their completeness, his ability to see past the physical appearance to the spiritual reality underneath, created a space where their own consciousness could shift. And when consciousness shifts, the body often follows. Sometimes instantly, sometimes gradually over days or weeks. but always beginning with that moment of seeing what's already true, rather than focusing on what appears to be wrong. This isn't mind over matter or positive thinking trying to deny reality. This is something deeper, something that touches the very foundation of how spiritual truth impacts physical experience. The transformation happens not because you're creating healing, but because you're recognizing wholeness that already exists. Think about the profound implications of this for every area of your life. Every relationship struggle, every health challenge, every seemingly impossible situation. What if the breakthrough isn't about getting God to intervene, but about you learning to see what God has already established? What if the real journey is shifting from a mindset of lack to a consciousness of completion, and watching how your external world begins reflecting that internal revelation? Put in the comments, "I'm learning to see differently." So how does this actually work when crisis hits? Because theory is beautiful, but we live in a world of real deadlines, real consequences, real emergencies that demand immediate response. Here's where most people get it wrong, and here's where the practice becomes truly transformative. Your first instinct when a problem appears is to immediately start problem-solving, analyzing, planning, praying desperately for change. But what Smith Wigglesworth taught challenges that entire automatic response. He said your first response should be silence, not the silence of confusion or helplessness, but the silence of recognition. Before you do anything else, before you make a single decision or take any action, you stop. You sit quietly, and in that stillness you acknowledge something that seems impossible to your logical mind. In spiritual reality, this is already finished. God's work is complete. What appears as a devastating problem is only your limited perception of something already resolved in divine consciousness. Now here's the part that makes this practical rather than just philosophical. You don't need to feel this truth emotionally when you start. You don't need to believe it with absolute certainty. You simply acknowledge it mentally, repeatedly, consistently, until something shifts inside you. This is the hidden truth behind every breakthrough story you've ever heard. There's always a moment where consciousness transforms before circumstances change. Let me show you what this looks like in a real person's life. Because without concrete examples, spiritual principles can feel disconnected from the messy reality we're actually living in. Sarah was a single mother with 3 children, and she was facing the kind of emergency that keeps you awake at night in cold panic. Eviction. $72 in her bank account. No immediate prospects. She had already spent weeks in desperate prayer, the kind where you're crying out to God with everything in you, promising anything, begging for intervention. Nothing changed. The eviction date kept approaching like a freight train, and heaven seemed silent. Then someone shared Wigglesworth's teaching with her about, "It is finished," and honestly, her first reaction was anger. How dare someone tell her that her crisis was already resolved when she was about to put her children on the street? But desperation makes you willing to try anything, even something that sounds crazy. She started practicing what she'd learned. Every morning before the panic could fully set in, she would sit in silence, not praying for help, not begging for provision, just sitting there acknowledging that in spiritual reality, her supply was already complete. The first week was torture. Her mind screamed that she was wasting time, that she should be doing something productive, that this was ridiculous. But she kept showing up to that quiet recognition. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, something began shifting. Not in her circumstances. The eviction notice was still real, the bank account still nearly empty, but in her internal state. The panic started loosening its grip. A strange certainty began growing underneath the fear. She still took action, still applied for jobs, still made necessary phone calls, but she was doing it from a different place inside herself. And then, in the 3rd week, something remarkable happened. A former colleague she hadn't spoken to in over a year called out of nowhere with a job opportunity. Perfect timing, perfect salary, exactly what she needed. Coincidence? Maybe. But the breakthrough came only after her consciousness had transformed from desperation to quiet knowing. Type in the comments. Transformation happens inside first. Sarah's story is powerful, but you might be thinking, okay, that worked for a job situation, but what about something more serious? What about physical suffering that won't go away no matter how much you pray? That's Exactly where Marcus found himself. 8 years of chronic pain following a car accident. 8 years of waking up every single morning to agony that dominated his entire existence. He'd been through multiple surgeries, each one promising relief, each one providing only temporary respite before the pain returned with a vengeance. He tried everything: prayer circles, healing ministries, medical specialists, alternative treatments. Some things helped for a while, but nothing lasted. The pain became his identity, his constant companion, the lens through which he experienced every moment of every day. When Marcus first encountered this teaching about recognizing completion instead of seeking healing, he was skeptical to the point of cynicism. Years of disappointment had built thick walls around his hope, but there was something about the approach that was different from everything else he'd tried. This wasn't about begging harder or believing stronger or finding the right formula. This was about a fundamental shift in perspective, a transformation in how he understood his relationship to physical reality. So he started practicing, not because he believed it would work, but because he literally had nothing left to lose. For 6 weeks, Marcus sat in that silence, acknowledging that in God's reality, his body was already perfect and whole. He didn't pretend the pain wasn't there. That would have been denial, not recognition. He acknowledged the pain as a limited perception of something already resolved spiritually. The first weeks were brutal. His body still screamed, his mind still doubted, nothing seemed to change. But he kept showing up to that practice of recognition, kept resting in the truth that spiritual wholeness was already his. Then, around week 7, something remarkable happened. He suddenly realized he'd gone 2 entire days without consciously thinking about the pain, not because it had dramatically decreased, but because his attention had shifted. Over the following months, the intensity continued dropping. 6 months later, the chronic pain that had defined 8 years of his life was completely gone. His doctors had no medical explanation for it, but Marcus understood perfectly. His consciousness had shifted, and his physical experience aligned with that internal recognition. But what about relationships? What about the emotional devastation of a marriage falling apart, where both people are involved, and you can't control the other person's choices? Jennifer and Robert were facing exactly that nightmare. 19 years of marriage unraveling, resentment so deep that simple conversation had become impossible, divorce papers actually being prepared. Neither wanted this ending, but both felt trapped in a toxic pattern neither knew how to break. Jennifer discovered this teaching almost by accident through a friend, and something about it resonated despite her skepticism. She began practicing alone, in secret, not telling Robert what she was doing. Every time anger or hurt rose up toward him, she would pause and silently recognize that in spiritual truth, love was already complete between them. Not the wounded human love they were currently experiencing, but the finished nature of divine love itself. She didn't see immediate results. For 3 weeks, absolutely nothing changed in their interactions. But then Robert started noticing something different about Jennifer, though he couldn't identify what it was. The atmosphere between them began softening almost imperceptibly. Conversations happened instead of arguments. Over 7 months of Jennifer's consistent practice of recognition, they rebuilt their marriage, not by fixing what was broken, but by recognizing completeness that had always been true underneath the surface damage. The impact of one person's shifted consciousness transformed both their lives. Write in the comments. One shift changes everything. These stories aren't random miracles or exceptional cases. They're the natural result of specific practices that anyone can learn and apply. Smith Wigglesworth didn't stumble into this consciousness by accident. He developed it through deliberate, consistent practice over years. And the beautiful thing is, he taught others exactly how to do the same. There are 3 core practices that form the foundation of this entire approach, and when you understand how they work together, the transformation becomes not just possible but almost inevitable. The first practice is what Wigglesworth called the practice of the presence. This means training yourself to acknowledge God's complete presence in every single moment, especially when problems appear. Not God who might help you if you pray hard enough, but God whose perfect work is already established right where the problem seems to be. When you wake up anxious about your day, before your feet even hit the floor, You pause and spend just 60 seconds acknowledging that God's presence is here now, complete and perfect. Whatever this day holds is already resolved in divine consciousness. This isn't wishful thinking. This is deliberately shifting your mindset from problem consciousness to presence consciousness. The second practice is resting in the Word. When you encounter a spiritual truth that resonates deeply, like, "It is finished," you don't just intellectually agree with it and move on. You rest in it. You sit with those words, letting them saturate your consciousness, not as affirmations trying to make something happen, but as recognition of what already is. Sometimes this takes 5 minutes, sometimes an hour. Wigglesworth would often spend entire sessions just resting in a single statement of truth, allowing it to unfold deeper and deeper meaning. This is completely different from repetitive affirmations. You're not trying to convince yourself or convince God. You're allowing a spiritual truth to reveal its own reality to your awareness. The third practice is recognizing spiritual identity. Most of your struggles exist because you identify as a limited human being who needs things, lacks things, struggles with things. But in spiritual reality, your identity is already complete as the expression of divine consciousness. When health issues arise, instead of, "I have a sick body that needs healing," the recognition becomes, "I am the perfect expression of divine life, and what appears as sickness is a misperception of my already established spiritual wholeness." This isn't denying symptoms. This is recognizing deeper truth underneath appearances. Now, I know what you're thinking, because this is where almost everyone hits a wall. When you're in genuine crisis, when the pain is absolutely real, when the bank account is literally empty and bills are due tomorrow, recognizing "it is finished" can feel like the most irresponsible, delusional spiritual bypass imaginable. You might be sitting there thinking, "This sounds beautiful in theory, but I live in the real world where consequences are real and problems don't disappear just because I change my perspective." And you're right to push back on this, because that's exactly where the teaching needs to go deeper. Wigglesworth wasn't teaching denial or pretending problems don't exist. He was revealing something far more profound about the nature of reality itself, that there are two levels operating simultaneously. The appearance is what you see with human eyes, the physical circumstances, the bank statements, the medical reports. The reality is what exists in divine consciousness, the spiritual truth underneath the surface. Both exist at the same time. You acknowledge the appearance honestly, but underneath that acknowledgement you begin recognizing that in spiritual consciousness, this is already resolved. This dual awareness is the key that most people miss. Leave a comment. I see both levels now. Let me show you what this looks like when the stakes are literally life and death, because that's where theory either proves itself or falls apart completely. Michael received the diagnosis that changes everything: stage 4 cancer, 3 months to live. He'd been a spiritual person his entire life, practiced faith consistently, lived with integrity. And when those words came from his doctor's mouth, his first response was feeling utterly betrayed. How could this happen? Where was God? What was the point of all those years of devotion if they didn't protect him from something like this? He spent 2 weeks in absolute despair, the kind that makes you question everything you ever believed. Then something clicked in his memory. This teaching about "it is finished" that he'd encountered years before, but never fully understood. In his darkest moment, facing his own mortality, he made a decision that seemed almost crazy. He would practice recognition of spiritual wholeness while receiving medical treatment, not rejecting medicine for spirituality, not choosing one path over the other, but recognizing spiritual truth while taking every practical action available. For 8 solid weeks, nothing changed externally. The cancer progressed exactly as the doctors predicted, but Michael kept showing up to that practice of recognition, kept resting in the truth that his spiritual identity was the perfect expression of divine life, regardless of what his body was currently showing. Then, so gradually he almost didn't notice at first, something began shifting. His energy improved slightly. His pain decreased imperceptibly. The doctors started using words like cautiously optimistic. Over 18 months of consistent recognition practice combined with medical care, the cancer went into remission, came back partially, then disappeared completely. His medical team called it unexplained spontaneous remission and recorded it as a statistical anomaly. But Michael understood exactly what had happened. His consciousness had transformed from identifying as a person with cancer to recognizing his true spiritual identity as wholeness itself. The external healing followed the internal recognition, not instantly like we'd prefer, but steadily, surely, completely. Now here's where the teaching goes even deeper, because sometimes the completion doesn't look like what you wanted. Rebecca was watching her business fail catastrophically. She'd invested everything, her savings, her time, her heart, her vision for the future. Bankruptcy was approaching like a tsunami that would financially destroy her for years to come. When someone shared this teaching with her about completion, her first reaction was pure anger. How dare someone suggest her crisis was already resolved when she was losing everything she'd built? But desperation opens doors that comfort keeps closed. She started practicing recognition, not because she believed in it, but because she had absolutely nothing left to lose. The first month, nothing external changed. The business continued its downward spiral. But Rebecca noticed something subtle shifting inside herself. She was making clearer decisions, thinking more strategically, negotiating from calm rather than panic. The business did ultimately close. That part of the story doesn't have a fairy tale ending. But through the process of recognizing completion, she preserved enough to start fresh, avoided total devastation, and discovered something far more valuable than saving. That particular venture. 2 years later, she built a different business, one more authentically aligned with who she actually was, rather than who she thought she should be. The revelation she received through that failure transformed her entire approach to life and work. Completion doesn't always mean getting what you want. Sometimes it means recognizing divine wisdom, orchestrating your journey even through apparent failures and devastating disappointments. Type in the comments, even failures. Serve completion. What happens after months or even years of consistently practicing this recognition? Because that's the real question nobody wants to ask, but everyone needs answered. Is this just a temporary high that wears off? Or does something genuinely permanent shift in how you experience life? Here's what I've observed in people who've walked this path long enough. And here's what Smith Wigglesworth himself demonstrated through decades of living from this consciousness. Something profound begins happening that you can't quite put your finger on at first. You stop automatically dividing your life into problems and solutions. You stop waking up with that underlying anxiety about what needs fixing today. You start experiencing life itself as the continual unfolding of something already complete, something already whole, something already finished. This isn't a belief system you're holding onto or a doctrine you're defending. This becomes the actual consciousness you live. From the lens through which you naturally see everything, you still face challenges. Let's be completely honest about that. You still encounter difficulties, disappointments, losses, frustrations. But here's what changes. They don't devastate you the way they used to. A financial setback that would have sent you into 3 weeks of panic now registers as a temporary inconvenience that you handle with relative calm. A health scare that would have spiraled you into existential crisis now becomes something you address practically while maintaining inner stability. Loss still hurts, rejection still stings, failure still disappoints, but none of it destroys you anymore because your identity isn't tied to circumstances. You know yourself as the finished expression of divine consciousness, and that knowing remains steady regardless of what's happening on the surface of your life. The transformation shows up in the most unexpected practical ways that you don't even notice until someone points them out. You realize one day that you haven't obsessively checked your bank balance in weeks, not because you suddenly have unlimited wealth, but because your consciousness isn't attached to the numbers anymore. You find yourself in difficult conversations that would have triggered massive defensive reactions, and you're just present, just listening, just responding with clarity instead of protecting a wounded ego. Your health becomes more stable without you doing anything different. You're sleeping better, feeling more energy, experiencing less chronic tension, not because you started some special wellness protocol, but because anxiety isn't constantly running in the background, depleting your system anymore. Your relationships begin improving in ways that seem almost mysterious. The difficult people in your life are still themselves, but somehow they don't hook you the same way anymore. You're no longer approaching relationships from need, from incompleteness, from trying to get something to feel whole. When you know you're already complete, you have nothing to extract from others, nothing to prove, nothing to defend. And that shift in your energy changes the entire dynamic of how people relate to you. These changes happen gradually, almost imperceptibly, like watching a tree grow. You don't see it happening day by day, but when you look back over months or years, the transformation is undeniable. This is the realistic picture of spiritual transformation that nobody talks about enough. It's not perfection. You'll still have moments of forgetting, moments of falling back into old patterns. It's not constant bliss. You'll still feel the full range of human emotions. It's not immunity to challenge. You'll still face real difficulties. But it is progress, steady and sure. It is increasing peace that becomes your baseline rather than your exception. It is the growing capacity to remain centered through challenges that would have once completely unraveled you. Write in the comments, "I'm experiencing this shift." If you've made it this far, I want you to know something. You're not here by accident. The fact that you stayed through this entire message, that you let these ideas settle into your consciousness instead of just scrolling past, tells me you're ready for this transformation. You're ready to stop striving and start recognizing. You're ready to see what's already been given instead of constantly begging for what you think you lack. This channel exists for people exactly like you, people who are tired of surface-level spirituality and ready for truth that actually transforms daily life. If this resonated with you, if something shifted inside while you were listening, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Because this isn't the kind of content you stumble across everywhere. This is the deeper work, the real work, the work that changes everything when you stick with it. And I'm here creating these videos consistently for people who are serious about walking this path. Leave me a comment right now saying, "This message was meant for me. So I know you were here. So I know this connected with you." I read every single comment, and honestly, your words often shape what I create next. Your presence here matters. And if this video helped you see something differently, if it gave you even one moment of clarity or peace, just tap that like button. It's a simple thing, but it helps this message reach other people who need to hear it, just as much as you did. Now, there's another video right here that goes even deeper into how to practically apply this consciousness in specific situations you're facing right now. Click it and continue with me over there. Let's keep walking this path together.